This is a tutorial on counteroffers. We'll go through three forms: the seller counteroffer, the buyer counteroffer, and the seller multiple counteroffer. They're pretty straightforward, but agents do make mistakes on them, so we'll cover that. And we'll go through all three. Let's jump right into it. So we start with the seller counteroffer. I'll put a number 1 up here to indicate this is the first seller counteroffer we're doing. Now, of course, if we counter a buyer and the buyer counters us, we have to then create a seller counteroffer number 2, and that's when you'd put a 2 up here. But for the sake of this example, we're pretending that we're just countering an offer. So of course the property address will go here, and this will automatically populate in the forms manager at forms.openhometeam.com. And we're countering a purchase agreement. Now again, if we were countering a buyer counter, I'll do an example here. Let's say the buyer had countered our last counter. Well, we'd put a number 2 here, we check this box, and we put buyer counteroffer number 1. This indicates this is the second seller counteroffer that is countering the buyer's counteroffer number 1. But we'll go back to the number 1 and continue as we're pretending that we're countering a purchase agreement. Date of form. This is the date of the purchase agreement, not the date we're drafting the counteroffer. And it says right here, date the above checked form, right there, was prepared. The reason why we're using the date of one of these forms up here is we want to just properly identify that form, because with counters, it's all about a sequence. You have the purchase agreement, and then each counter whittles it down until the parties come to an agreement. So it's important that all forms, by the way, all forms will get signed no matter how many counters. Both parties are still signing the purchase agreement, and they're signing all the preceding counteroffers, including the final counteroffer. So keep that in mind. And each subsequent counteroffer just further amends the original purchase agreement. All right, so what I like to do here is, these are the terms. So you have section 1. I'll just numerically itemize it. I'll say 1, you can just say the price to be, I won't type the whole thing out, but you could say purchase price to be blank. You could say closing, and then we'll say price. I'll just go like that. And then I might go down to a second line just to make it easy on the eyes, easy to read. And I might say like something about the close of escrow. I'm just abbreviating it so I'm not sitting here typing while I'm talking. But the point is that you can just go line by line. You can even do it by A if you want to do it alphabetically instead of numerically. You can go line by line and just put in your terms. And that's it. Now all these terms are amending the purchase agreement. Now a mistake I see agents make is that they restate terms in the purchase agreement that remain unchanged. Meaning if the close of escrow was 30 days in the purchase agreement, they'll write something like close of escrow to remain 30 days or close of escrow to be 30 days. All you're doing is repeating something that's already agreed upon. The point of a counter is that you're only itemizing terms that you want to change. That's it. These are modifications. So, and it's saying right here, everything in the above checked document, purchase agreement, is accepted subject to the following modifications. What are we changing? If you're only changing the price, you put it here. I see agents putting all this other stuff in here, and you don't need to do that. All you need to put is what the parties don't agree on and what you're proposing. Counteroffer shall expire and nullify at 5 p.m. on the third day. You can change that here, of course. And the third day, the clock begins when the last seller signs it. So let's say there are 2 seller signatures. Whenever that date is, that whatever the latest date from the last seller is, that's when you start that 3-day clock. And then the buyer will sign it to execute it. Now, of course, the buyer can check this box. You don't see the checkbox here in this PDF, but there is a checkbox on this form in the Forms Manager, and the buyer can write counteroffer number 1. Why? Because the buyer is going to sign this form no matter what, even if they disagree with it. They just need to check this box here, and then they need to create a buyer counteroffer number 1. Now we'll jump over to a buyer counteroffer number 1. So let's say the buyer doesn't like one or many terms on the seller counteroffer. Well, the buyer's going to go and do the exact same thing. First counteroffer, property address is going to go here. The buyer's countering the seller counteroffer number 1, date of the seller counteroffer, date of form right there. The buyer's going to make the following modifications. So jumping back here, let's say on the seller counteroffer there were 2 items. One was the price and one was the close of escrow. Let's say it's like 30 days or something. Well, let's say the buyer sees this and says, okay, well, I'm fine with the close of escrow provision, but I'm not okay with the price. Well, that's when the buyer's going to sign, check the box right here, and then the buyer's going to only change the price. That's it. That's it. The buyer's only changing the price. And then this, of course, can expire on the 3rd day. Buyer's going to sign. And the seller can either accept or do the same thing. The seller can check a box if they're going to counter again, and they're going to do a seller counteroffer number 2, and then the seller signs. Now, this can go back and forth indefinitely, but usually 1 or 2 counters gets the job done. Now let's go over to a different scenario, the seller multiple counter. What happens when there's a multiple bidding scenario, which has been pretty much the industry standard for the last several years, and you have a seller that wants to counter more than one buyer? Well, this is the form they use. The last form, this seller counteroffer that we did over here, this is only for countering one buyer. In the case of multiple, you're going to use this form, hence the multiple in the name. You'll put the property address, purchase agreement, we're doing a multiple counter to the purchase agreement, date of the purchase agreement, a list of what we're changing. Now, this can all be different for each buyer. Let's say you like a couple aspects of buyer number 1, a couple aspects of buyer number 2. These are all customizable. So you're not going to do one form for all buyers. Now you could do one form for all buyers, but you don't have to. You can use this form and keep in mind the number stays the same. Sometimes I see agents make the mistake and they go, oh, well, I'm countering 3 buyers, so I'll do 1, 2, 3. No. You have one form, number 1, and you can change the terms and send it to each buyer. Now, the buyer can accept or counter. Of course, if the buyer counters, they're going to check this box right here. They're going to put their countering on their buyer counteroffer number 1. But let's say they don't. Let's say the buyer wants to accept. Well, the buyer will just sign this and then send it back to the seller. Here's a big difference between this form and the normal seller counteroffer. The normal seller counteroffer, once the buyer signs at the bottom and sends it back, you have an executed agreement. It's done. The parties are now under contract. With this form, it requires a second seller's signature. And the reason is that what would happen if you sent this form to multiple buyers and they all signed it and sent it back? You'd have a problem. You'd be contractually obligated to more than one party, which is not possible. It creates a legal problem. So this form addresses that by saying, okay, well, the buyer agrees, but the seller has to sign a second time a countersignature to certify this document, and the seller needs to sign it again and then return this to the buyer. So it requires 3 sets of signatures. Both are 2 by the seller, 1 by the buyer. So keep that in mind, that the seller needs to sign a second time. Just because the buyer has signed doesn't mean they're in agreement, because in theory, the seller can counter 3 buyers, all 3 can accept, and then the seller then has to choose which buyer they're going to proceed with here. That is a tutorial on the counteroffers. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.